Friends. So I'm really excited to be here. I'm always very excited to do anything in the Minneapolis DevOps community. DevOps Days Minneapolis might be my favorite DevOps Days, but don't tell the Chicago people because that's the event that I run. But what we do is it's always nice because the Minneapolis event is always right before ours. So I come up here and I steal a bunch of ideas from Joe, and we never implement them nearly as well. The other reason I was very excited, first of all, it's always amazing when Bridget lets me come speak at her meetup. I don't even ask, because I'm afraid of getting told no. But I'm really excited because Bridget, asked me, knew I was coming up here to actually meet with SPS Commerce. I've been in this building all day long. It's awesome. And then she asked me if I wanted to speak at the meetup, and I said, okay. And I said, here's some talks I can give. And she said, do you have anything new? Which normally means I'm tired of your old stuff, but Bridget doesn't watch my talk, so she doesn't know my old stuff. But so the point is, this is a brand new talk. You're seeing it for the very first time. No one else has ever seen it. You can either choose to be excited by that or disappointed. We'll see what happens in about 45 minutes. So it might be a little, we'll see how it goes. But what I'm trying to do with this talk too is it's very broad in scope. So there may be parts of this that you're like, I totally knew that already, Stratton. I didn't need to be told, but the good news is it's 45 minutes long, so it's not 45 minutes worth of stuff you already know. I hope not. Also, it's driving me crazy that I messed up my picture on this slide. So first thing that I have to remember. So anyway, and again, I work at PagerDuty. I'm a DevOps advocate. So that justified being here. I've got PagerDuty stickers. We've got Arrested DevOps stickers over here. Come take some swag. So let's talk a little bit about services. All right, so imagine a world where you understand what you're working on. You can do it if you try, right? You're clear on what your dependencies are, who relies on you, and what you're delivering. You have a clear vision of your impact on the business, your customers, and you know what you want to do to continue delivering value to those people that you care about. You innovate, you try new things, and you can solve problems effectively when they come up. You and your colleagues work together to bring value to your business without blame, and you can make changes without being afraid of unintended consequences. That's where we want to be. You might already be partially there. If you're all the way there, why are you sitting there and not up here is what I want to know. But it's totally cool, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about service and service ownership, right? So what is service ownership? So service ownership means that people take responsibility for what they deliver at every stage of a service's lifetime. We're going to talk about it. What do I mean by a service? Because if we've learned nothing else from many DevOps talks and many DevOps books and many DevOps things, is that words mean lots of things and they don't always mean the same thing to everybody. It'd be too easy if they did. We want to think about how we communicate across the organization with your partners and stakeholders. And partners in this case doesn't necessarily mean like another company you do business with. It might, but think about your partners within the organization. You have stakeholders who are people that care about the effectiveness from a business perspective and other reasons, and you have people that you partner with, right? It's all the DevOps love. All right, so let's start with the basics, right? What is a service? So we're going to talk about that. We're going to spend 45 minutes talking about services. What the heck do we mean by that? So here's the thing, right? A service can be a lot of things, right? It could mean different things to different people. Maybe it's a microservice. Usually when I talk about this, people immediately go there because it's microservice has service in the name, so it must mean that. But it doesn't necessarily just mean microservices. So I got news for you. So good news is if you're not doing the microservice thing, you don't have to tune out and go eat tacos in the back of you. There's stuff you can learn, right? It could be a slice of a monolith is something we might consider to be a service. It can be an internal tool. Maybe it's just a piece of functionality. Maybe it's a component. Maybe it's shared infrastructure, right? Maybe it's a feature. These are all things that service can apply to. And none of them are wrong. Some are less wrong than others, but we won't judge that. Here's what it boils down to, right? If it provides value to other people, that's a service. And that's the part that matters for this conversation. There are certainly times when being specific about what service means, and it means a certain thing, apply. But in this case, if it provides value to other people, we consider that a service. So the first thing you have to do when we think about service ownership and how you're working together as a team is understand what it means to you and your organization. And like I said, there's no wrong answer. The wrong answer is when nobody in your organization has the same agreement about what the word is you're talking about. So that's where you kind of want to start. This is how we think about it at PagerDuty. Our definition, we think about it as our definition is more specific to an infrastructure that's composed of distinct services that are written as separate pieces of code. But that's just how we do it. That doesn't mean it's right? It can be applied to parts of a monolithic code base as well, or external tools. But think about it as a discrete piece of functionality that provides value that's wholly owned by a team, right? So there's ownership boundaries that come into play. This is why your whole monolith is probably not a service, right? And maybe it is, but probably isn't. And it's about shared understanding, right? We want to come to a shared understanding as to where the boundaries of any given service are and be able to identify who the stakeholders are, right? If there's multiple teams contributing, maintaining, and supporting a given service, this is even more important. It all comes down to communication and shared understanding. And you can start, one of the ways that really helps understand where these boundaries are is to consider who is responsible for the service that you're defining. So a service really should be wholly owned by the team that is on call for that. And there's of course levels of on call, but it's about the responsibility, where that comes in. That's where you're going to see some of those demarks happen. Now, if there's multiple teams that share responsibility for a service, it might be better to split that service up, if possible, into separate services, because you've got contention, right? Like, so who is responsible? And those of you who have seen me talk about incident response before know that if everybody owns a thing, nobody owns a thing, right? So if there's two teams that supposedly own the same service, guess which one is going to jump up and down for the page in the middle of the night? Answer is neither of them, right? So no, people don't get excited about that, right? So separating into smaller services are sometimes called service mitosis. And that's actually a picture of mitosis. But with service mitosis in an organization, they generally have as a rule that at a certain team size or volume, some of them do it by volume of code. I don't necessarily love that one because lines of code don't necessarily mean something. But it's some demarcation, some point, some inflection point, you decide that something becomes multiple services. And services should be set up granularly enough to help identify some sources around problems that you have. So if two microservices always behave as one, and fixing a problem on one means fixing it on another, it might make sense to consider those the same service. Again, we're not here to be pedantic about, well, technically, Matt, these are two microservices, they must therefore be services, right? It's about where that boundary is. And if you're finding these two things are connected, considering them one service from an operation and management and development perspective can be helpful. What about monoliths, right? So if you have a monolith, the way to think about this is how are you going to address on-call responsibilities for it, right? My notes here say monoliths tend to be the cause of a lot of incidents. And I don't like to say things like root cause and the cause of an incident, but yeah, you know what? Monoliths are the cause of a lot of incidents. But the reason where this becomes challenging is because it's a big set of code that doesn't necessarily have clear boundaries. And so these incidents that come from a monolith, they can be actionable and sometimes non-actionable. And if one team owns the monolith, they usually don't own any other services unless the on-call load for that monolith is low, right? Because there's a lot for that. So the thing is, if multiple teams share responsibility for that monolith, you can consider gradually identifying different sources of functionality within it and routing those alerts to the teams that have the right context, right? So each source of functionality can be represented as a different service for your documentation. You're enumerating your runbooks and wikis along with your on-call ownership in tools like, I don't know, PagerDuty, right? And here's the thing, service ownership is a shared responsibility. So your software engineers who are writing the code are not the only people accountable to the ownership of that code that they write, right? And that sounds a little tricky because you also know that I believe in, you wrote it, you run it, you're responsible for your own code, but that bigger piece of the service is not just about the people who write the code or who wrote the code. So let's think about where some of those roles kind of come in. So we think about that development team, the software engineers, the people who actually slung the code, right? So developing a service is more than just writing code. Yes, of course, it involves code in a shared repo with documentation, unless you're believing in the no-code movement, but that's not really a thing. Generally, you'll have some kind of a README that explains what the code does, and maybe a contract with other services that can be understood if they have to interact with it. At least I hope you have that. You may not have everything in place when you're initially developing a service, but you should still have some standard procedures your organization has defined about what does it mean to create one. And here's kind of, this is it, this is the tweet, right? Your service should make sense to other people who will interact with it. There's nuance to this, but remember, you are not the only person who will interact with this service, unless it's projects that I write. Then nobody uses them but me. Then it's okay. Don't be me, right? Have more popular projects. They provide a lot more business value if someone other than you uses them. So you want to make sure your code is reviewed by other members of your team with whatever process. I'm not here to tell you exactly how to do code review other than put someone else thinking about it, right? Because the thing is, you're not always going to be around to answer questions about what your code is intended to do. Nobody knows what you meant, right? They only know what they see. So it's your responsibility to make it understandable, because otherwise you're a single point of contact, and that's no good for anybody. All right. They say the two hardest things to do in computer science are caching strategies and naming. And also there's a off by one error joke in there too, but I'm not putting that in here. So it's totally normal to use creative names, Greek mythical figures, inside jokes, pop culture references, space missions as placeholders for service names. When you have a small organization, you think everyone's always going to be able to remember that inside joke, right? But hopefully, your organization's probably going to grow, right? Maybe it's going to change. You're going to welcome new members to your team, and eventually the memories of that inside joke will fade, and the inside joke now becomes something you have to explain to everybody over and over and over again. And at that point, if you have to explain the joke, it's not even funny enough to be worth it, right? So it's never good. Point of example, not about naming services, but why inside jokes sometimes cause confusion. So you may know, Bridget and I host a podcast called Arrested DevOps, which, as you may have inferred, is a pun on Arrested Development. There's a popular character on the show named Steve Holt. I named our Slack bot Steve Holt. Bridget, who doesn't watch the show, says, who is Steve Holt? And why is he in our Slack? So, and any little bit of amusement I got out of that was, found to be less useful when Bridget didn't get the joke. And then I had to explain it, and she still didn't think it was funny. So it's cool. So be specific, right? Consider naming your service something specific. Maybe naming it to explain what it does, what a concept, right? If you already have services with less than specific names, don't panic. You don't have to make changes to everything at once. Fix forward and start naming services with more specific, clear names. I understand this is not a trivial task. Ask colleagues and people you interact with what they would expect it to be named, right? What do you think this would be called? Default to longish names instead of shorter ones. Characters are free. This is not a tweet. This is a service name, but not too long, right? Because you know what happens with names that are too long? They get shortened into acronyms, and acronyms are just as hard to understand as inside jokes. So make them clear. So here's some examples of names that are specific. User authenticator, shopping cart, login, report generator. Pretty sure that if you saw a service with this name, you could take a gamble on what it does, and hopefully you'd be right. If you weren't, so even though this is a specific name, don't name your report generator shopping cart. That's just confusing. That's even worse than the silly names. Here's names that aren't specific. Calling something Pac-Man, unless you're actually building Pac-Man, you probably aren't. Apollo, BurgunDB, right? Maybe see this one. Artemis. I have worked at 4 different organizations that have named a service Artemis. I am sure I will see it again. This doesn't help anybody, right? And then you have to explain what it is. One of those organizations is PagerDuty. We have a lot of services that are named after things like this, and it's actually very hard for people like incident commanders who are trying to help run an incident and see there's an issue with Artemis. But to know there's an issue with notification router means a lot more. Also, I got news for you. Your executives really don't care about something called Artemis. Thinking about how we describe things, right? being descriptive, providing the documentation. So the service name should be descriptive, but of course, you're not going to contain all the description of everything the service does in the service name unless it's going to be an incredibly long service name. So a couple things to think about here. Think about what is the intent of this service, this component, this slice of functionality. There's things to record the purpose of the service, right? How does it deliver value? That's really important to know, right? Is it part of a customer-facing feature? And then you can understand how it impacts customers, how it rolls up into the business components. So the description can also mention other components that the service may interact with, but know that those may change as the other service owners make changes to those components, right? Dependencies, just a couple thoughts around dependencies. Know that they're a thing. There's a couple practices to bear in mind, right? So circular dependencies. Some of this, one of the things I would also like to point out is people who are very experienced software engineers are going, duh, to a lot of this. But those of you who are not software engineers and have a different role are looking at this and going, oh, that's an interesting thing, right? So it's really easy to do this. I do this a lot, right? And then again, thinking in those dependencies. And this is one of those things where, like, those of us that have an ops background, we feel this way a little more naturally, but also know from a dependency perspective, who consumes this service? Who are you a dependency for? And what do you depend on that's outside of that? Understanding where these relationships happen is a really key thing, and it's really important to kind of keep that in your description. And what do you owe to the people who consume your service, right? This, talking about management of APIs is a whole different talk, but a couple things that are really key and sometimes get missed is thinking about versioning, right? And why does it matter to version your service? Because you would like to be able to release new versions of it without asking your hundreds of thousands of customers who all have to go test it, right? It's interesting how often I've worked at places that this was a really foreign concept, where we'd say we wanted to release a change to an API that was being consumed, and we couldn't change it till we did regression testing with every one of our customers. And I remember going to our organization and going to our engineering and saying, like, I don't remember the time that when Google updates their Maps API that they came to me and asked me to test it, right? You also owe clear documentation and examples. And one of the things to bear in mind when you're designing an API, especially a public API, not everybody's as smart as you think you are, right? So always think about who's going to potentially consume this. And just because it makes sense to you as a Java developer doesn't mean that that Go developer who's consuming your service thinks about things the same way you do. Or heaven forbid, an SRE who's not a code slinger like you are might actually need some real examples. This is something I feel pretty strongly about, right? Okay. We think about tiering our service, right? This is a boundary crosser, but thinking about how does your working with your product owner and your other engineering leaders to understand what the expectations are for this service. A tier 1 service would have the strictest expectation of latency and uptime. They have the heaviest responsibility in the organization. In the case of PagerDuty, if we consider something a tier 1 service, that's something that requires a 24/7 on-call, multiple layers of robustness. It requires a DR plan, bunch of other stuff. You want to understand this because it's going to be part of the design from an engineering perspective, but this really is very cross-functional, right? This is, you can look at this later. These are the things I just told you that are true about tier 1 services at PagerDuty. Whereas our tier 2 and 3 services, we expect Monday through Friday support. The reason I bring this up is to think about these are things that provide supporting functionality. They're not on the critical path. This is also, if it's a new service, it's not generally available. Maybe we're testing it out with custom, rolling it out slowly. We don't expect it to be tier 1 yet. I think about the roles of your sustainability team. This might be the team you think of as SRE or ops. I've lately started calling those teams sustainability because otherwise I keep having to say SRE/ops/web ops/tech ops/whatever. So we just say sustainability, right? So here's the thing, right? Things are going to go wrong. Got news for you. And as you learn about the different nuances of your service, you really want to keep a record about what you've tried that can help resolve common issues, right? In an ideal world, you have the ability to resolve these common issues at the source of the problem within that source. Now, runbooks are a contentious topic. They are only helpful if they are accurate. So it needs to be part of your software development lifecycle to update that runbook when there are changes. An out-of-date runbook is considered harmful. So it's better to have no runbook than to have one that's inaccurate. These are tricky, but they don't have to be comprehensive either, right? They can be the things that are best. And the thing is, the more comprehensive you try to make your run book, the more quickly out of date it is going to become, and the less likely people are to actually want to do it. When you think about alerting, as you can imagine, working at PagerDuty, I have lots of opinions about this, but here's kind of some short ones to think about. You should work to only alert on items that are actionable and those that are related to business goals or functionality. Don't wake me up in the middle of the night to tell me something I can't do anything about and doesn't actually affect our customers. Does that mean we don't care to record that information? Of course we care to record that information. It's very interesting, but it's not an alert, right? And we're going to talk a little bit more about some good ways to set those thresholds and monitoring in a little bit. I just want to bring this up. So resiliency, we talk about this. We're like, yes, the sustainability team is in charge of the resiliency of the service. No, it's not, because a service does not have resiliency. People have resiliency. It's in charge of its robustness and reliability, right? Because here's the reason I bring this up. And every now and again, I have to be pedantic about something because otherwise I wouldn't be me. I'm off root cause and now I'm on to resiliency. But we want to, when we think about high availability, we're not talking about resilience. Resiliency is the ability of a system to adapt, right, to things you don't know. What we're trying to build here is how we can respond to things we do know, the robustness and reliability. So the sustainability team tends to think about these things quite a bit. They don't own all the responsibility, but that's usually where their headspace is at. Okay. Now let's think about, program management. This may be a role that your organization doesn't have, but if you're if the folks in this role, right? So there's an element of unpredictability in service ownership, right? We get action plans and outcomes that come out of postmortems and PIRs. We have proactive maintenance we need to do. Everything doesn't fit nicely into a feature roadmap. So by the way, if you're in program management and you don't know that, let me say it again, everything doesn't fit nicely into a feature roadmap, right? So as a program manager, you need to be mindful of the necessity for this buffer and for this unplanned work that's going to happen. In some organizations, this might be called project management. So if you don't call it program management, and not all orgs have a role that does this kind of a thing, okay? But these are kind of the responsibilities when it comes to service ownership, right? They help define what is done. Like, this is harder than it seems, right? Emotional awareness of stress on the rest of the team. This is something I consider a responsibility of program management. Most program managers would not ever think this is something they're supposed to worry about. But they sometimes are some of the only ones that have that kind of visibility because they're looking at a broader scope, right? And then also they have that visibility into the connective tissue work that's occurring between different teams and different features, right? Some of this, there's a lot of times when somebody has a different view that's very hard for us to get. I see this as a vendor. I come into organizations a lot, and I'm the only one talking to a whole bunch of teams. And it's the first time all those teams talk to each other because they came in to have a meeting with me, right? Your program management can be like that. And then also awareness of the impact pulling people away from other projects to solve a problem has. Because again, they have that visibility, or at least they should. And then product owners, right? So they're responsible, as we know, translating the requirements of the customers beyond what something looks like or what it's capable of. Because frankly, if all a product owner is taking a requirements list from a customer and then going to engineering and saying, go make this thing that Sammy just told me she wants, you're like that dude in Office Space. It says you take the requirements with it, you're providing no value. So if that's what you do as a product owner, you should stop doing that because you're probably going to be out of work soon. So the thing is, customers are always asking for uptime, performance, and security, but they don't use these words, right? So that's why the product owner has to think about what are the impacts, right? And why things like uptime, performance, robustness, these are features of a product, right? Even though they didn't show up in a user story from a forum and a focus group, right? Because again, without uptime, a customer can't get to that wonderful new feature that you've delivered, right? Without performance, they're going to leave in frustration. Without security, they won't trust that new feature. So these things all matter. And it's really helpful when product owners understand those responsibilities of the service are part of their job, right? And then management, right? This is just sort of generally, your management people, your line managers, your executive managers, right? Thing is, service ownership in this model really works best when it's championed from the top and consistent across the entire product and engineering organization. You can start this stuff smaller, but you really do need to have this this championship because there's so much interdependency within the org chart, right? When that comes in. So like leaders, they help set goals to balance business priorities with achievable engineering goals, right? So if leadership is expecting 100% uptime for your main product, it's going to be pretty challenging to create a reasonable plan about how these things can possibly support it. It's destined to fail, right? So another piece is like investing in tech debt, right? Leadership establishes this cooperative and blameless service ownership culture, defining your top level objectives, making room and investment for maintenance, documentation, and sustainability. This is what we would like them to do. We're learning. It's getting better. All right, cool, right? So let's go a little deeper into some of these things. We kind of talked about where the roles are, but where do these things come in? So a couple things. What are you observing about this service when you're thinking about, I know we're thinking a little holistically, right? We have this service, so let's talk about it, right? What are we observing about it? And this is a whole other talk in itself, by the way, so don't expect this one right now, but I bet you there'll be a good one at this meetup sometime. So, but let's just think about, right? There's a few things to keep in mind. Note, you actually want both of these things, and these things are not the same, okay? So there you go. Now you just heard an observability talk. So I really like this quote. Like, it's very common. Like, you're amazed that my quote is not from Charity Majors, aren't you? That's okay. I've got Charity somewhere else. But I really like this one from Barron, right? So he's like, monitoring tells you whether the system works. Observability lets you ask why it's not working. You know, again, it's the things that we can't plan for. And a lot of times, I always think about, when I think about observability, I was like, I kind of ran into this problem 15 years ago, 10 years ago maybe, you know, and I worked for, in the company I was at. We would have an issue, and by, you know, we'd resolve the incident, everything, and then my CTO would come to me afterwards and say, Matt, why weren't you monitoring for this? And I said, Pat, because up until last night, we didn't know it was possible. We didn't know that that could happen. And so the thing is, but then it's really hard to dig into that. So the monitoring is going to tell us that a bad thing happened, right? We know that some level of thing that we care about is not being that thing. But it's not going to tell, it's only going to tell us things we already knew about. And I like this idea of empathy-driven alerting, right? So focus on the customer experience. Always goes back to the key business metrics around the experience of your customers. And here's your Charity quote, right? It's a good one. Nines don't matter if your customers aren't happy, right? I don't care about the CPU utilization of this particular box if the customers aren't happy, right? Or vice versa, right? Or if they are happy, I don't care about how much it's using either. So it's always going back to like being able to understand key business metrics. My favorite trope, and it's going to have to come up in this talk, is do you know how your company makes money? If you don't, go find out. We'll wait, right? Because we need to know that. Even if you, and I understand that not everybody works for a profit-driven organization, but I think you can make the extrapolation. You know how you're providing value. You know what is important to how that organization provides value. And it always comes back to some key business metrics. And setting those requires understanding how your business works, understanding how your company makes money. And the other thing is, if I ask you and I say, you know, what's your key business metric, and you rattle off 15 things, that's not a key business metric. That's a bunch of things you care about. So examples, if you know, Netflix's famous one is stream starts per second. And the thing about these key metrics are the ones that are like, if something happens with this, it's a clear indicator and it's a clear thing we care about. And it doesn't mean you only have one. It helps if you have one, you know. So being able to understand that defines a lot of the things that matter. But these metrics should always go back to customer experience. And again, this is a whole other talk in itself. So, but just a little refresher because of the point I want to make about them. So if you're not familiar, so let's start with service level indicators, right? These are building blocks. And remember, they're not goals, but they're the measure. These are the things that are indicators of the reliability, the robustness, the performance of your service. So they might be things like latency, throughput, availability. Again, notice I don't say 90%, you know, availability. It's just availability is an indicator, right? It's not goals, but what is the measure? And these roll up into service level objectives. And again, these are made up of the SLIs. We measure them over time. And the thing about them is they're not contractually set, right? These are an objective. These are an internal measure. Your customers don't know what these are. That's okay. And again, you can go to SRECon and you'll see a 45-minute talk about this one slide. So, you know, it's a teaser. But here's where it matters. And then finally, you have your SLAs. And these are terms that we've all known forever and ever and ever. Here's the thing. They're basically driven by your SLO. It's the same idea, the same metric. These are things that are contractually legally binding. Basically, this is when you owe your customer money. So question is, number one, do you want to be alerted when you're breaking an SLA? No, it's too late. You want to be alerted because you don't want this to ever happen, right? So, but these are where they build in, because you know you're rolling up to these SLAs is why you want to tie things to that as much as possible. So this is a term that I came up with on accident, but I really like. It happened with me trying to say happiness and sadness at the same time. And so it's the hadness point. So I was talking to Dr. Jennifer Petoff, who is the editor of the Google SRE book. She's a program manager for SRE at Google. So she has credentials I don't have, and the fact that she agrees with it means it's okay. And so we were talking about, where do you set an SLO? And we came up with that it was the hadness point. And this is the point directly, the inflection point of customer happiness and customer sadness, right? It's exactly the threshold where they pass from being happy to being sad. That's where you set your SLO, because if you set it too low, you're going to be alerted on things your customers are still totally happy and everybody's cool. If you set it too high, a lot of customers were sad before that happened. So is there a scientific measure of hadness? Not yet, but it gives you kind of the point, right? You want to set it, and again, they should be set tighter than your SLAs because we want to know about them before we can owe the customer money, right? And you alert on SLOs, not on SLIs, as SLIs do not have a goal, right? They are a dial, they are a measure. And again, you probably want some alerts on an SLA, but not for responders. You know who wants to be alerted on an SLA? Your business management, because they know they're about to have to write a check. Hopefully, that alert never goes off because you've caught it on your SLOs, right? Okay. So then the thing about, okay, great. So we talked about what we're observing, what we're thinking about. How do we actually respond to this service? This is also a really bad sentence. I need to think about how to rephrase it, because it's more, how do we respond to issues or incidents with the service? So again, first time doing the talk, it's great, right? So how do we want to think about this, right? So escalation policies, right? What is an escalation policy? What do we mean by that? It's the order of responsibility for reacting to new issues that are detected on a service. And there's several different approaches to how you can coordinate the triage, acknowledgement, and ownership of the response. And one is, we sometimes refer to this as a DevOps model, but okay, it's DevOps as opposed to other, which is why we call it that, right? But usually with organizations that follow more DevOps principles as opposed to central ops or a NOC or things like that, they generally have at least 3 levels of escalation for critical path services, starting with the team that's currently maintaining that service, right? So the team that owns that service is usually a first escalation point. So what does it mean to be in that first level, right? It's the representative of the team that's currently maintaining the service. Remember, you may be on call for a service you didn't originally build. That's normal. It's okay, right? But this should be a rotation of folks on the team who are ready to respond to issues on that service. They have some domain knowledge around it. And frequently, there are multiple people on this first level. It's not delightful if there is one person in the whole organization who is first level for that service and they're the only one. It's not delightful for your organization for a couple of reasons. One, what if something happens to them? Like, for example, they get another job because, boy, does it suck to be the only person on call for a service, right? But a lot of times, too, when we think about, some teams will treat the first level of this policy as a primary point of contact for questions about the service as well. So they could be an interrupt handler that shifts with the on-call rotation. So it's not necessarily just about incidents. It could be anything where they're kind of, again, someone's got a question. It's not a critical thing, but they're playing triage, playing router. They're being able to do that. That works out pretty well, usually, as long as your system's set up that way. Because the reality is, somebody has a question, they ask the person they know. Right. So it's a great idea to try to do this. It doesn't always work out so well. And then when we think about second level, so this may be another rotation of people on that same team. So at PagerDuty, our second level of the escalation policy is the same group of people as the primary level, but it's offset by a week, right? The secondary for a given week was primary for the week before, and then the whole schedule rotates, and our logic is that this person still has context from the week before. This isn't true of every team at PagerDuty. Actually, every team at PagerDuty is allowed to do their escalation policies the way that they want to, but that's a common pattern. And it's giving an additional, it's not necessarily going to a more senior person, but it's the point of that, okay, I'm the responder, I exhausted what I'm able to do, so I need another domain expert who's actually probably somebody on my team, right, to be able to help out. And then for us, our third level, this is usually when it becomes about escalating to leadership, right? This might be the engineering manager for the team. For our tier 2 and tier 3 services, most escalation policies are these 3 levels. And then for our tier 1, we often have a 4th escalation, which is senior engineering leadership, to kind of bring them into play. And then when we think about escalating, right? So how does this happen, right? Most organizations understand that everyone is human. Sometimes, for various reasons, a person who's on call might not be able to work the current problem, right? If the first level responder is unavailable, the second level usually activates within a time period. A small gap between level 1 and level 2 does not necessarily make the service more reliable, and decreasing the gap is a trade-off, right? If we're like, okay, how much time is there between when Bridget doesn't respond and it escalates to Joe? The faster you skip to the next level, you're actually causing a little bit more trauma to that team, because you're putting a lot more anxiety on level 1, because when you're on call level 1, you know you have to respond in 5 minutes or it escalates, right? So having that gap is not always a problem. And you have to think about what the impacts of that are. And the other thing is the escalation can occur manually, right? It could be, it's not just because Megan didn't respond to the page, right? It can be, Megan's like, I need more help. I need another set of eyes, right? And we want, at PagerDuty, we believe that our first level responders need to feel comfortable asking for help as soon as possible. So we maintain that the second level of escalation should be someone the first level responder feels safe with, right? Responding to an incident is the team's responsibility. It's not an individual's responsibility, not a single person at a time. So the first level responder may be the first person who started working on the problem, but there's no rule requiring that that's the person who actually asked to resolve the incident. That's just where it starts. This is a DevOps meetup, so we're not going to talk about these, but they exist. These are other ways to do escalation. There's a central approach. Hybrid is, you know, how we say things instead of bimodal IT, because bimodal IT was terrible. Thanks, Gartner. Thinking about tuning your service, right? So we're continually investing in making this better, right? So one of the things that could be really key is having regular operational reviews around your service, looking at how are your looking at your monitors, looking at your SLOs. Are you breaching them? Is this continually? Because the thing is, a lot of times you may have an interrupt, and it's quickly resolved, and there's not an action item. There's not a thing to go fix in the code, but you're looking for patterns, and you're looking for small tunes and small tweaks you can make over time. And that's the thing. That's where you look for patterns, because every incident is different. I get you, but every snowflake has 6 sides. And what we really want to be able to see is whether or not something was an anomaly, because sometimes shit just is weird, right? That happens. Welcome to computers. But what we want to do is say, like, I'm starting to see a pattern here. So that means either something really bad is gonna happen, so we want to be in front of it, or this is something that is systemic, right? It's not just some really weird conflation of just the right user doing just the right weird thing that ain't never gonna happen again. And here's the thing, right? When we're looking at this tuning, and again, always looking back to these reviews, what alerts do you actually need, right? So if you alert on 5 things and you understand all 5 of those things, right? That's something you can reason about. If you alert on 1,000 things and you treat each of those with equal priority, it's highly unlikely that any of them are getting the attention that they need. So continually reviewing, and this is where operational reviews are a big thing for on-call handoff, right? You need to have a consistent way. This can't be just a thing you sort of do by accident and then your spare time. It's a really good idea to say when you're doing, especially when you're doing on-call handoff and rotation, that part of that is an operational review, which is just, hey, what happened? Because it's giving an opportunity to put some eyes on this and doing it in a programmatic way, right? non-actionable alerts are terrible, right? Okay. This is why you always do a postmortem, even if it wasn't an actual incident. That's how you know to refactor your alerting. So this comes up a lot. It's like, okay, something happened. We thought it was an incident. Turns out it wasn't. So we closed it. You know what? Do a postmortem anyway. Does this? Yeah. Does this mean schedule a meeting with 25 people and spend an hour and a half of the no, the postmortem can be 5 minutes long and you can just write it up, but you want to look at that because there was a reason. And we want it to be okay for incidents to be created. We don't want people to be like, I better damn well be sure that's an incident before I trigger incident response. You want to be able to do that, but the way that we're going to see that things were non-actionable is by reviewing it when it occurs and saying, oh, interesting. We have a flappy monitor here. Or we're alerting on this thing that's actually not actionable. So we should stop doing that. And the way you'll discover that is by doing a postmortem on that. And that's why you don't do postmortems only on your big, scary sub ones that cost the company $1 billion. So, and then work with your alerting tool for suppression of non-actionable alerts, because your monitoring tool needs to do all the things it does. But the way you're being alerted, you can work to be able to suppress them if you know they're non-actionable. And I hear that PagerDuty has a pretty nice feature like that. Understanding the business impact, right? Again, know how your company makes money. What does this service do to tie in with regard to customers or revenue or just the value that your organization provides to its users? Do you know what the business metrics are associated with your service? And we can kind of go by and just sort of looking at all the stages that happen from a lifestyle perspective. The lifestyle of a service. And where these steps come in, right? So we think about designing a new service. We've got a brand new, beautiful service providing new functionality. It's all nice and beautiful in greenfield. This is amazing when this happens, when we get to do this, but sometimes we do. So some of the things we think about, right? Like we need to understand the customers, right? Who are the consumers? And again, a customer can be external to your organization, it can be internal, but someone is consuming this. Someone is a customer of this service. So again, load testing and staging. I know staging is a lie, that's cool, but this is a brand new service, so it does start somewhere, right? You want to at least be able to model what you think it's gonna look like. If you are not involving your sustainability teams early in the design, you're in for some trouble, because when we kind of, as we know, if we kind of offload that to the end, they're gonna find some problems and it's too late for them to do anything about it, and it all gets thrown in the backlog and never gets done. See also security. Understand your indicators, understand those alerting requirements, whatever documents, don't forget it. And then again, all your security stuff. And again, the stuff needs to happen early. This is why there's a whole new word about this DevSecOps thing, which by the way, nobody in DevOps ever said security wasn't part of it, but it's okay. We like words, right? Okay, maintaining and iterating. You know, now we've got our beautiful bouncing baby services out there. It's making money for us. We need to keep it running and we need to keep improving it, right? So things we talked about, like remembering to keep that API version, communicating to its consumers as much as is reasonable, and as much as you think is reasonable, do more. Being able to keep that proactive maintenance is really key when you think about your backlogs. You have to maintain it. You have to feed your dog, or else your dog gets really sad and stops playing fetch with you. Continually addressing the tech debt that we discover, right? It's so very easy to keep pushing this stuff down in the backlog. And then we can just thinking about all the things that go into what does it mean to actually release this? You need to have a consistent way of understanding. And then sometimes it's time to get rid of them. And this is something we really don't think about a lot. And this is why you end up with a lot of components and services hanging around that nobody actually knows what they do anymore. And people also sometimes are very afraid to turn them off. And this happens in a little bit of a different way. But thinking from as an old ops perspective, there was always that one box in the data center. Nobody knew what it did, but damn it, ain't nobody gonna turn it off either, right? And I did have a few change controls that I did put in when I was at an insurance company, which was to shut off a server, and the validation was, did anybody complain? Those were hard to get past the cab, by the way. Similar to that was my favorite, was when the change was to turn off a server, and I got him kicked back to say, what's your backup plan? And I was like, turn it back on. right? Make sure. So anyway, things to think about is, again, back to that point, identify the consumers of this service as much as you know, and understand what is that business impact, because sometimes there will be one, but it's acceptable, right? Maybe you got a couple customers that are still using that service and they're making you $100 a month, and your AWS bill for that service is twice that. I'm not an MBA, but something tells me maybe it's okay to get rid of that one. And then, but have a process for how you're offboarding the consumers of this service, right? If you're shipping them to something different, it's not just like, okay, by the way, we're turning this off. And this is really hard to do well, by the way. If anybody's doing this well, I applaud you. So the thing is, service ownership includes communication, compromise, and commitment, right? It's almost like you're in a relationship with the consumers and customers of your service. Think about it that way, right? Just want to give a couple acknowledgments to folks who directly or indirectly helped me with this. So Lilia Gutnick, Julia Dunn, Charity Majors, and Baron Schwartz. All the images are attribution-free, free images from Pixabay. And if you enjoyed this talk, here's a few more things about me, right? So podcast at ArrestedDevOps.com, get some stickers. I run DevOpsDays Chicago, and until I saw Bridget's slide, I forgot that now you can go to DevOpsDays.org/Chicago instead of doing this. By the way, I run the website, and I didn't remember that. You can find me on Twitter if you haven't seen it plastered all over, but here's a whole website in case you don't know how Twitter works. And you can also find videos and slides and stuff of previous talks at speaking.mattstratton.com. And in case you didn't know, I got a new license plate. So thank you very much for having me here, and I look forward to talking to you in the future. Yeah, that's fine. Yep, totally. Oh, wow. Boy, I nailed that exactly. I had no idea how long the talk was going to be. So that was exactly 45 minutes.
All right. Thank you. All right, Maddie, that was fantastic. We are going to run mics around, and we will not be offended if somebody needs to duck out, but we are going to run mics around and take questions. And your questions will be recorded, though we don't have the camera set up quite yet to zoom in on you during your question. All right.
I can do an interpretation of your question. Only
Okay.
when Andy's asking.
All right. Your question will be audio, but not video.
Yeah, I was curious how you pronounce your license plate.
Wow. I say cube cuddle. I can't pronounce, but I think it's Bechdel, I think is the one that I've heard.
kubectl.
Well, there's the one that's sort of like Bechdel, but I can never.
Control.
Yeah. But I've always
kubectl.
Kubectl, that's it. Yeah, Kubectl. If you really want to turn that on.
Okay, I'm not the only mic runner, am I? Okay, great. You've got one up front.
Closer to you, Nate.
I just don't want everyone to wait while I run over there.
I'm here just to get free advice from you. So
Okay. I haven't figured out how to charge for it yet, so you're good.
Okay, good. So the way that my team does on-call rotation right now is whoever's on call, that's the whole shebang, basically. You're taking everything during the day and at night to the best that you can. Now, right,
Okay. That could be okay with some caveats, right?
So, yeah, that's exactly why I bring that up. We're learning as we go. It used to be, like hot potato.
Oh, that after you didn't, then went to somebody else.
Yeah, well, it was just like nobody wanted to do it. And there was one guy.
Nobody wants to do it.
Yeah, well, so anyway, so just advise about that and what's better, and
So a couple things to bear in mind. Being the on-call or the primary responder during the day and at night is not necessarily a problem.
So I should have clarified. We take points out of the sprint and loan. We take points out of the sprint and loan them to that person. And basically, that's the understanding. So it's like, hey, half of your time is or a third of your time, or whatever.
So the thing to bear in mind is that that's always going to be just a best guess. That really gets you badly to try to play that game when you're a shared resource. Like, so just to not go too crazy into that, but I remember I ran a tech ops team where my sysadmins were shared across multiple product teams. And I had to allocate a certain amount of time for production issues. And I was like, does this mean that once that time is up, we don't work production issues anymore? No, right? So there's a flex. You've got the right idea, just as long as it's not a thing like you have so many the big thing is during your on-call week, there's two ways to think about it. One is that it's just generally just being on call, even if nothing happens, adds stress. So it's a tougher time, right? So as long as we understand that. The other thing, I know a lot of teams, a lot of folks will, during your rota week or time, is your focus is on sustainability and all that tech debt, because you're also thinking that way, right? So those also, because they're things that don't have some specific commitment to a customer. So if you don't finish it, it's a little less impactful. So that's a time to kind of work those stories. The other thing with that impacted, it's a little harder. So I know a lot of people really like this idea that it's like, we switch rotation around by how many incidents you work. And then the problem is predictability for everybody else, right? So it sounds delightful to say that, like, if Megan gets called, then PagerDuty will automatically, move Justin to the next on call. Justin didn't know he was going to be on call. And you know what? His daughter's got a play he's going to, right? So like there's ripple effects. So what we do at PagerDuty, most teams do this. It's not even part of our rules or policy, but it's just part of our culture, is if you're on your team and you know that someone worked a long incident, someone will volunteer to take the override for him for the rest of it. It's just sort of a thing. It's like, okay, and we try to do that to help keep each other with self-care. The other thing to bear in mind too, a lot of times when people kind of get into this model, like, oh my God, I'm gonna be on call because what if I have to work this 8-hour incident all night, then work all night? You shouldn't be working an 8-hour incident. That's too long. That needed to get handed off at a certain point. So we have, I think it's 2 hours, which is pretty short. Most people don't pull that one, but at PagerDuty, it's generally speaking, an incident commander or a responder at about 2 hours is supposed to hand off to somebody else, because there is a point of diminishing return of having somebody working on this very stressful incident for a prolonged period of time. You can't always do that. Not all teams have broad enough place to do that, but having that as a general principle, right? Being able to do that, and usually that's why you have a backup, right? They probably hand off to the backup. Now the backup might hand off back to you after 2 hours. It's not saying I did my 2 hours, all done, but at least I'm not dealing with it, because that's the stuff that you really do stop being good at it after a certain amount of time. It's not great. It's really not.
Like finding out PagerDuty.
Oh yeah. Oh, for our brand. Oh yeah. That would be especially bad if people knew that we had bad on-call culture. Yeah.
So related to that, you don't have an on-call schedule, which really means that
you're always on call.
Yes, and you're the only one that can divine the Kafka tea leaves.
Yeah. That's one of the things. It's interesting that you say that, because a lot of times there's folks who are not used to being on call. Like when you're trying to transition, they're usually software engineers, because by the way, apparently software engineers think that only software engineers care about their families. Right. I guess, that's a whole other thing. But the problem, what I always tell people, I'm like, if you're not in an on-call rota, you're always on call, right? Because people know how to find you. The beautiful thing about being on call is you get to go off call. And yes, I understand there's nuance to that. And yes, I understand there's certain roles in parts of the organization where they're always going to find you, but usually you're probably getting paid a bunch for that. So stop complaining. It's okay. Right. But as an individual contributor, generally speaking, it means that you get to sit there and say, I am not on call tonight. I can go to my son's Christmas party and not have to worry about getting called. So that's the downside. It's hard to shift to that model, and especially when you don't have a lot of people. Yeah. One way to start, by the way, getting into that I found is, because what people are always afraid of with on-call is that 2 a.m. page, right? So if you have folks who've never been on call before, don't throw them in the deep end. Start by saying, we're going to put you in PagerDuty or whatever during the day. Because guess what? You're already responding to incidents. What we're doing is we're doing it through our regular process rather than drive-bys in Slack or whatever. So getting used to that model and saying, okay, maybe you're just on call during business hours, so you don't have to worry about the fact that you care about your families and nobody else does. But that eases people into it. because it is a different change to be used to being woken up in the middle of the night. But if you are the right person, they will find you. You know, so.
Yeah. So this is actually the perfect segue into what I was going to ask. So here's somewhat of a case study. Small software company relies on its support team to be the first level if there's an incident when the service is deployed out to the customer. Trying to transition that team into a place where perhaps that lead developer that did a lot of the work to build out the customizations or configurations or whatnot for that customer, getting them accustomed to being on call for some period of time during a go live. Is that something that seems like a typical transition, or a transition that you've seen before, where there'd be a support team that's first level? They aren't the ones who wrote the original code, of course, as you had mentioned earlier in your presentation, that can be the case. But then trying to get someone like your lead software engineer for that project as your technical.
It's very common, because that's how enterprise IT has done IT for the last 30 years,
Yeah.
is you have a support team, and guess what? It doesn't work real well, right?
Okay.
Because the problem, anytime you aren't putting domain experts involved as quickly as possible, is you're asking a group of people to know about a lot of things, right? Now, it can work when you have this support team that is following SOPs and SOP, standard operating procedure, and only doing that. To a certain point, if that's all those people are doing, that's a thing that computers can do better, usually. And those people are actually pretty smart, and you can be putting them in a position where they're actually doing something more effective. But it is usually stands to reason. You're like, well, I don't want to pay my really expensive people to have to do support stuff, so support goes over here. It's really bad for your company culture too, because it creates this sort of model of like, I am too good to go on call. That's for support. Now, that transition is common, right? Like, because that's how a lot of people do it. They have a production support team. And sometimes those are the people that fix bugs. That's a whole other code smell. We won't talk, our organizational smell. But yeah, moving to that. And it isn't necessarily that, again, depending on the size, and like you said, depending on the software company, like, so it's about finding where those boundaries of knowledge and responsibility are. So it doesn't have to be that the lead developer is always on call, but someone who's involved with it. But when it's somebody's only job is to be on call to fix things that are broken, first of all, as our systems are a lot more complex than they used to be, you're asking a lot. And they won't, for that person to also have a visibility into all of the things. And unfortunately, because of the way you usually think about it, those are usually very low paid people. And we're actually asking them to know the most in our whole organizations, which is why it generally doesn't always work out super great. There is a difference between that and having like a NOC, which is an organization that is very much built around being able to understand the right people and being able to run an incident. But that's usually not what that model that you're talking about is. It's usually just like you're the poor schlubs who are in the support team, and you're the ones who have to carry the pager. Like I said, so moving out of that as much as you can. And part of it is because of the organizational dynamics. The other part is just that sort of thing that if I know I'm on the hook to support stuff I wrote, I care more about sustainability. I know it is. People are incented. It's a thing. It's not the only thing. It's not the only reason to code it, ship it, own it, right? That's part of it, but it is absolutely true. It doesn't mean that I'm going to write perfect code because I don't want to get paid. You're still, even if I don't, but we think about things differently, and we think a lot more about operability when we know we're part of that.
And a couple of questions. First, a follow-up on this topic, very interesting. Typically, the people who are the best experts in stuff, they are called last because they are very busy with other stuff. So, and on one side, yes, we don't want to create this layering of, first level support, second and third, but at the same time, the people who are on the third level of support, they usually overwhelmed with different requests from all sides. So,
well, that's because they're thinking about support as the secondary thing they sometimes do. It's not a primary thing of supporting the thing they built, and it's not baked into their job. So there are many organizations that are very large that have very talented people that would be considered level 3 that are quite capable of being able to be the first level. But it's a mentality shift, right? It's that support and on-call is not an ancillary thing.
And another question, please. So we were talking about the services in a broader concept, not just microservice,
Right.
but you mentioned that other things could be a service. So does it make sense to start looking at everything that the team is doing from the services perspective, or it will be kind of like a exaggerated approach, unnecessary approach? Does it create a management kind of nightmare when we need to define everything between everybody, what is a service and who is responsible? So does it make sense to even approach that?
Well, a lot of it goes back to trust of the organization, right? If you don't trust your teams to be able to operate their tools and they have to be told how to do it, it's a management nightmare, because you now have a couple people up here that are telling everybody how to do their job. And if that's, and sometimes organizationally that works. And in a case like that, it's very hard because now you're creating this, but being able to create guidance, but then saying at a certain point, this team, this delivery team has responsibility and has ownership of that service. So they don't have to be told every little bit of how to do that, right? There's guidance that's created, there's process around it, and there's capabilities, but a lot of it is trust, and a lot of it is this. So I guess the thing is, defining everything as a service doesn't work in command and control, right? It works in being able in more of the lowercase agile. And I need to stop walking over there. Sorry.
The cameras don't go everywhere.
I know. I forget about the camera. I was like, everyone can hear me. It's totally fine. So a lot of it, again, it's like it's not necessarily going to work for every single organization and every single organizational model. But the other part is a lot of this. There's data around it. There's science around it. Go read Accelerate, right? High-performing organizations work this way, and I've seen every industry do it. So it's hard, but is it easy? Absolutely not. Can you do it tomorrow? Absolutely not. So working small helps.
Yeah, Matt. Hi, I'm Greg Wonderly. I've been following you on Twitter, and
I'm sorry
for a while. Yeah, me too. I don't sleep well. Early in your conversation, you were talking about finding dependencies, and we're trying to diagnose a problem. And it's not so bad when you have a small application, because I can just say, okay, here it is. But when we start to look at full stack dependencies, and for a mature product, there's nobody around who knows what the heck is in there. How do we go about discovering that in an effective, fast manner? If we have our lower level people who are not well trained, it is really going to be hard to get them started and on the right track. Do you have suggestions for how to fix that?
Step one, invent a time machine and go back and document your shit. Okay, barring that, we can't do that. This is where and by service registry, I don't necessarily mean a technical solution of that, but just being able to have some kind of a mapping and some kind of a piece. And sometimes that's just the documentation for that service that shows the best that you know, but some of it's going to require some investment in doing some research, right? Because it's also not effective to continually page out until you finally find the one dude that kind of remembers how it works.
If they're still with the company.
Right, yeah.
They may have retired.
Back to that, who knows what that server does, right?
Let's talk afterwards, because I have some ideas on how to solve that problem.
Sure.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to call the Q&A here because I want to make sure everyone gets a chance to talk to each other, to come up and ask their individual questions, mobbing Stratton and making it impossible for him to get away from here. And I want to make sure that everybody also gets a chance to go have a chat with Couchbase. Remember, they're hiring, and they would love to chat with you.
I would, along those lines of talking to each other. So we heard a bunch of people ask questions. Those questions were asked of me. Guess what? Yeah, I have the mic right now, but that's about to stop. So if you have ideas or experience with some of these things, you might invite yourself to share that with folks who ask the question. So it's not just me doing all the talking, because I barely know anything. I just convinced Bridget to give me a mic.
Thank you so much, Matt, for sharing all of this wisdom. Please, round of applause for Matt Stratton.